Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Climate Solutions Research Collective, I'd like to thank you for watching this recording of the Unpacking COP28 panel discussion hosted at UBC Vancouver on November 21st, 2023. We acknowledge that both historical and current actions and inactions place some individuals, groups, and communities at greater risk of impacts from climate change and climate policy over others. We hope that having conversations like today's can contribute to our learning and sharing of ideas and solutions. The Climate Solutions Research Collective is a new pan-university initiative designed to build connections across UBC climate researchers, groups, and initiatives, and to encourage new collaborative research on climate change solutions. We have brought this panel together to explore how the United Nations Climate Summit's work and discuss the pressing issues up for negotiation in this year's summit. UBC has been sending delegates to COP events for several years, and this year is no exception. You can find details about the delegates and resources from the UBC community at UBC Sustainability's webpage. Thank you to Dr. Michael Brower, who is moderating the event. We'll start with short introductions from each panelist, followed by a question and answer period.
So our first speaker is Catherine Harrison. Dr. Harrison is a professor of political science who studies the politics of climate policy. She's co-editor of Global Commons, the domestic decisions, the comparative politics of climate change. She's attended several of the COP meetings and has written a series of op-eds from each. Our next speaker is Jeffrey Chi, who's a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development's Resilience Program. He is a UBC alum, and his work focuses on ecosystem-based adaptation, the National Adaptation Plan process, and multilateral environmental negotiations related to climate change, adaptation, and biodiversity. And I believe you're attending COP this year, is that correct? Our next panelist is Milind Kandlikar. Milind is a professor with the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, as well as the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. He will be discussing climate financing and the financing of adaptation and mitigation measures to address climate change. And our final panelist is Philippe Lebillon, who's a professor in geography at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. His research engages with the environment, development, security nexus, including climate change, ocean governance, extractive sectors, and conflicts. He'll be speaking to us today about fossil fuels and all that has to do with climate change. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Harrison, our first speaker. And I should just remind you about the format. We'll have short presentations from each panelist. We'll do some series of Q&A, and then it's your opportunity for those of you in present and in person to submit questions on Slido. And I think it's somewhere. We'll post it up in a bit. So save those questions for just a minute and we'll post those and announce the Slido link. So, Kathy.
So I'm just going to give you what is COP, how does it work, and there. I'll give you kind of the bloodless version, but I want to preface it by saying COP is exhausting, it's intense, it's emotional. I found it very hard, and I cried multiple times every day when I was there. So as I'm sure you know, COP is the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Parties in this case refers to governments that ratified the UN Convention. And because the Paris Agreement was negotiated within the auspices of the UN Convention, it's also the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. At its core, COP28 and all the other ones is an intergovernmental negotiation. It's about governments making deals with each other. And that's critical because individual countries are reluctant to act alone for two reasons. The first is no country acting alone can fix this problem. It's going to take all hands on deck. And secondly, because they're all worried that if they go beyond what other countries are doing, the advantages of those additional emissions reduction will be shared around the world, but they get all the costs, and their industry, their economy will be hurt. So it's all about reassuring each other that they are acting together and with consistent ambition. And as if that wasn't hard enough, there is no world government. So there are no votes taken at COP. The decision rule is consensus. They have to get over 190 countries to agree to the texts that are adopted. And that means that in theory, any individual country can veto the outcome. Now, in practice, having that veto is more useful to some countries than others. If you think about the lowest income countries, which have contributed very little to the problem of climate change, have very low income, it's not useful for them to veto an agreement, because the alternative is to be left with what we've got now, to be left with nothing. On the other hand, countries that have a lot of emissions, large populations, like the US, the European Union, which negotiates as one, or have a lot at stake in the outcome, like OPEC oil producers, have often wielded vetoes at strategic moments to water down agreement. What happens at COP? It opens with plenary speeches. Those are impassioned, often quite moving, often by the prime minister or president, or if it's a less high priority COP, the lead climate negotiator for that country. And then the first week they turn to technical committees. So the bureaucrats are negotiating on a work plan that is often continuing from previous COPs. They've been meeting all year. They try to get close to agreement, and then the thorniest issues that they can't resolve, those are the ones in square brackets in the draft texts, they hand over to the politicians, usually the environment or climate ministers, who attend in week 2 and try to hammer out final agreements. And there's always some drama at the end, because the hardest things to get agreement on end up at the very end. At that point, it's a question of, have they got everyone on board? The media will be reporting there's a scrum going on right now with John Kerry and the lead negotiator from the EU and someone from India, and COP always ends late, sometimes as much as 2 days late before they get agreement. It's not only about governments. In fact, tens of thousands of other people attend COP. Environmentalists, representatives of indigenous peoples, business representatives, including the fossil fuel industry, scientists, labor, and so on. They are all there because they are trying to influence the government negotiations, either directly, shaming them at COP, or indirectly by sending messages about what positions they're taking and what's going on back home to citizens where they came from. And there's all kinds of other stuff going on besides the intergovernmental negotiations. There's a trade show where countries and businesses and NGOs have pavilions. There is a conference with often dozens of concurrent panels going on. Outside the blue zone, where you have to have an official badge, a delegate badge to get in, there's often a big civil society conference, protests, marches. I have no idea what will happen in UAE at COP28. So to set up the next speakers, what am I looking for at this COP? The Paris Agreement differs from the previous agreements, especially the Kyoto Protocol, in that it's iterative. Rather than getting countries to commit to distant targets, the idea is that they commit to a first set of targets, and then a few years later, they up their ambition, and they reassure each other, lock arms, and march forward together. So there's a process built into that. There are various key decision points or key moments along that process. One this year is the global stock take. How are we doing? Not well. So one question is, what impact will the global stock take have on discussions? I'm also watching to see what happens with financial transfers. There is always a huge gap between the wealthy countries that cause this problem and the low-income countries that are suffering disproportionately in terms of climate finance. There was a kind of breakthrough on loss and damages last COP. Where are we now looking forward? And finally, the Paris Agreement, you might be surprised to know, doesn't mention fossil fuels. Remember that whole business of any country being able to veto language in the text. But there has been a real move afoot to draw more attention to fossil fuels, fossil fuel production, and the need to phase out fossil fuels. So those are the three things I'm watching for.
I'm going to go for it. So I'm just going to give a little bit of beyond the negotiations. So Dr. Harrison just presented what happens in what's called the blue zone. And as was mentioned, there's all kinds of other activities. And one of the things that is important, I think, as you'd be seeing, the media will focus on the negotiations, and there's always this tension and things run late. But there's lots of other things that are happening behind the scenes and are already happening, and really important to understand that this is an annual event, and it's also an opportunity to really track incremental progress. This is not a situation where one COP is going to completely change the trajectory of the world. These build upon each other and hopefully build upon each other in a positive direction. And then that's something that we'll get into with the panel discussions. Also, each COP has specific themes. So some of the prominent themes this year are there's a health day for the first time, and also food and agriculture is a really important component. Another thing to look out for is related initiatives, and some of these actually may actually have more impact than the COP negotiations themselves. So one great example of that is a global methane pledge, which has now been signed by more than 100 countries to really take action towards this very potent, short-lived climate pollutant, methane. And this was actually reinforced just last week as part of the US-China statement. So this is not binding, but the US and the Chinese governments got together and committed to address methane. So actually China specifically in their program, and also actions on renewables. So these things also happen kind of behind the scenes and in the buildup to COP. It's also an opportunity for new science, and you'll see many prominent researchers will time, and journals will time releases of important papers to coincide with COP and to the buildup of COP, and I'll share a few examples of that with you in a second. And also many organizations will issue progress reports. How are we doing as we approach this? So one example, and sort of in the context, is that for the first time, it seems as though we had a day when global mean surface temperature exceeded 2 degrees Celsius. You will recall one of the targets from the Paris Accord was to limit warming, annual mean warming to 1.5 degrees. We're not on track to do that, and we've seen now a day, actually this month, when it looks like the global average has been 2 degrees above a pre-industrial average. There's also some evidence growing that warming is accelerating. Many possibilities for why. One possibility is what's been called the Faustian bargain, and this is a reduction in cooling particulate matter in the air. So this is something that actually has to happen as we remove fossil fuel combustion, coal combustion specifically, but some of this pollution actually cools the atmosphere. So as we move towards decarbonizing and reducing CO2 emissions, we reduce these particles that are not only cooling, but also very harmful for human health, and that's led to an acceleration of warming. Also, this is still very controversial. You'll see stories actually of volcanic eruptions perhaps being responsible for this accelerated warming, but the data are showing that actually warming now is happening faster than it has in the previous years. Again, something that was anticipated, and it's something that we'll have to go through, leads to increased urgency to actually act very quickly before we exceed the so-called tipping points, for example. Another important paper that was released within the past several weeks focuses on forestry, so something that's very important to Canada, and the ability of forests to actually absorb carbon dioxide from the air. And this paper really was a more detailed and more sophisticated reanalysis of earlier work, and showed that there's actually untapped potential in forests to actually absorb CO2 from the air. but we're actually not doing a very good job of managing our forests and managing our forest ecosystems to allow them to actually realize their full potential to absorbing the CO2 in the air. And then also stating very clearly that while there is potential for forests to do more, that's not enough. So we also have to really work on emissions reductions as well. And again, we'll see how this plays out in the COP negotiations, and specifically, for example, what Canada is going to say in these negotiations relative to fossil fuel reductions versus more reliance on forestry. As I mentioned, also progress reports. So one very important progress report is the United Nations Environment Program, what's called the Emissions Gap report. And this is really talking about where we need to go for different trajectories. You can see a 1.5 degree trajectory, a 2 degree warming trajectory. What do we need to do in terms of reducing emissions? And as you can see by looking at this report, and I'm not going to get into the details, we're not doing very well. What we have done is we've reduced the rate of increased emissions. So it looks like we're sort of plateauing, but we haven't started to decrease, and we need to decrease much more. And by some measures, in order to meet the Paris 1.5 target, we have about 6 years left to do that. So not much time. Meeting maybe a 2 degree warming, something 12 to 25 years or so. So again, I'd urge you to sort of look at this, lots of detailed information. And then some of the work that I do is focus on what are the health impacts. And the Lancet, a very prominent medical journal, releases the Lancet Countdown. And this is tracking progress on where we are in terms of warming today. And we already know that extreme heat, for example, kills about 500,000 people each year around the world. And that's projected, let's say, by 2050 to increase almost fourfold. Additional 500 million people or so perhaps experiencing food insecurity by 2050, and a number of other impacts, again, depending on which future we take. So I will stop there and turn it over to Jeffrey.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Jeffrey. I'm a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. We're an international think tank, and I was a UBC alumni and super happy to be back here and speak a little bit about the upcoming negotiations at COP28 in Dubai on some of the kind of my area of work, which is global stocktake, adaptation, and loss and damage. So as Professor Harrison has already mentioned before, the Paris Agreement operates on a different kind of way. It's a process of iterative cycle. So countries pledge and then repledge over and over again in a 5-year time cycle. So in order for countries to really be able to understand where we are in terms of global climate action and what more needs to be done, there's a process called the global stocktake. So essentially the idea is countries gather together every 5 years and we have a nice friendly discussion on where are we, where do we want to go, and how do we get there. So by answering these kind of questions, we get to know kind of what are our collective progress in terms of reaching the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, which is limiting global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, aspiring to limit it under 1.5 degrees Celsius. And also, countries need to kind of submit something called a nationally determined contribution every 5 years. NDCs are a policy instrument that countries outline what are their domestic responses to climate change, how many emissions they're going to cut, what are the ways that they're going to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and how are they going to fund their climate action. So this is the key instrument of the Paris Agreement, where they need to submit every 5 years. And every 2 years before they need to submit the NDCs, we conduct the global stocktake to review where we are in terms of global climate action and what countries could do to do better for their next NDC cycle. So the next NDC will be released in 2025, and 2 years before that is this year. So this year in Dubai, we will be kind of deciding on the final political messages that came out of a 2-year global stocktake process. So countries already have engaged in over 250 hours of meetings and discussions on kind of answering those questions in terms of where we are, where do we want to go, and how exactly do we want to get there. Over 170,000 pages of information was submitted to the United Nations to kind of answer those 3 questions. And based on all of the discussion and all those questions, I think we came up with some kind of overall assessment in terms of the state of global climate action. And to me, I think it really tells both the story of ambition and success, but also the story of some of the gaps that's being left, and there are much more that we can do. So the first kind of key messages coming out of this process is that there has been significant progress being made by countries and by local communities at all levels since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. Comparing a scenario where there wasn't any global efforts in coordinating climate action versus where we are now, we are already at a much better place than a decade ago. But there's more to be done. I think the window of opportunity to secure a livable future is rapidly closing, and countries really need to stay on track and continue to do more in terms of both reducing emissions, but also adapting to the impacts of climate change. Because communities around the world, especially in developing countries, they are at the front line of climate impacts, and they are already feeling those impacts of climate change. And we are already seeing a lot of losses and damages to human lives, to their livelihood, and also to infrastructure. And for a lot of indigenous peoples, they're losing traditional and ancestral lands, which they have strong cultural and traditional ties to. So these are imperative that we have to do more in terms of both reducing the emission, but also adapting to those impacts of climate change. But this is not an easy task for a lot of the developing countries. They urgently require finance, technology, as well as human capacity to really put their plans into action, to translate words into action. Because a lot of countries have amazing nationally determined contributions. A lot of countries have amazing national adaptation plans, but they just don't have enough money, and they just don't have enough people with specific capacities to put those plans into implementation. So this is when a lot of the rich countries' historical responsibility argument comes up that we've emitted over the past century, and now there is an obligation for rich countries like Canada, like the US, like Australia to pay up their fair share and to transfer some of the money so developing countries could adapt to climate change, could reduce their emissions, and could achieve climate resilient development in the future. And one of the key item this year, or key finding from the global stocktake, is that we're seeing losses and damages associated with climate change impacts around the world. And some ecosystems have already reached the limit of adaptation. What that means is there is no adaptation options left for some ecosystems in the world. They are already too far gone in terms of climate change that we cannot bounce back. So in these cases, countries are negotiating the funding arrangements for losses and damages that was agreed to last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. But there are a lot of different kind of contentious points that are being negotiated by countries. So these are just some of them. So first of all, who can get money from the fund? Is it all developing countries, or is it just some developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change? Which organization hosts the fund? There's a lot of talk about the World Bank hosts the Loss and Damage Fund, but they're not necessarily the most popular options among developing country parties. What type of funding is available? Is it going to be grants so that countries can just get the money and use them? Or is it going to be loans that they have to actually pay back, which I think the next speaker will get more into in his presentation on the finance. And lastly, kind of what type of losses and damages are being covered by this fund? Is it only going to be losses or damages to infrastructure, so the economic kind that we can actually quantify, or is it also going to cover culturally significant losses and damages, which a lot of countries would say, yes, you absolutely should fund that. but how exactly are we going to quantify that? So there's a lot of issues that countries need to hash out over the next 3 weeks, if you count the pre-COPs happening next week, to kind of answer these questions and really to get this fund operationalized, so countries can get access to their much needed finance to implement their climate action and to help communities. Yeah, I guess I'll just stop there, and happy to answer more questions. Professional hazard. No slides. Okay, that's okay. So I was charged with speaking about climate finance. What I'll do is I'll just define what we mean by climate finance, give you a bit of a sense for what's happened to date and what to expect in this COP. Jeffrey just touched on one part of what I was going to say, which is loss and damage. I'll add a few comments to that. But let me start with what do we mean by climate finance, right? It's a term that is interpreted variously, so it could be, for example, just simply all the funds for activities and projects aimed at mitigation and adaptation across the world. Big picture, everything, add it all up. And you get, this is the UNFCCC's numbers. These numbers are always strange because the method, because the methods are, they vary, etc. But if you take the UNFCCC's word, it's $1.3 trillion has been spent annually in the past few years. I don't know the exact time horizon there, of which $450 billion is subsidies for fossil fuels. So $1.3 trillion on fossil fuels alone, of which $450 billion are subsidies, right? Compared to that, climate mitigation and adaptation is about $800 billion. So that's the scale of investments we've been talking about all over the world. So that's one definition. The other definition, which is more germane to what we are speaking about, which is COPs, is what is the funding that is provided by rich countries to developing countries in order to mitigate climate change and adapt to the consequences of climate change, right? So that is the focus in COPs. And in it was 2009, there was an agreement that rich countries would collectively mobilize is the keyword there, $100 billion towards climate-friendly activities in poor countries, okay? Now, it's been, 2020 has come and gone, and so there was an assessment of how that, whether we met that target. And again, here, it all depends on how you do the math and the accounting, but somewhere between $50 and $80 billion were mobilized in 2020 for helping developing countries both mitigate and adapt to climate change. The adaptation piece is always a bit lower because, as Kathy said, rich countries like to focus on mitigation. Did you say that, Kathy?
I don't think I did, but I agree.
Someone said it somewhere. Anyway, it's hard to follow 4 speakers or 3 speakers. So that's where we are. So one step back. In 2015, which was 5 years after the first global climate fund was introduced, there was a decision to extend that date to 2025. Right? 2025 is coming up. What next? What next? How should we start thinking about this pool of money to help developing countries deal with the effects and mitigate climate change? And for that, the discussion started about 2 years ago. And I went down this rabbit hole for the past couple of weeks because I was to give this talk, and went through a whole bunch of documents, went to some meetings to figure out just what is it that is emerging out of this, revamped global climate fund. And it's got a very non-intuitive acronym, NCQG. It's the new collective quantified goal, right? And so the idea is that collectively, it's all voluntary, mind you. It's never been any sort of requirement on rich countries to put this fund together. That we figure out a mechanism that will take the world from 2025 onwards in terms of making investments in adaptation and mitigation. So just to give you a sense for what kinds of numbers we are talking about, right? On the adaptation side, what do you think the numbers were for the heat dome in BC in 2021, was it? Like the cost, sorry. 2 billion? 10 billion? Okay. It's not a very intuitive number. It was between 10 and 17 billion. At least that's what the CPP, the Center for Policy Research, Canadian Center for Policy Research estimates, right? And think of it. It was a relatively minor event compared to, say, I hate to say this, but it was a minor event compared to, say, the floods in Pakistan or the hurricane that went through Libya last month. Okay, so these numbers of 10, 20, 30 billion, they just roll off our tongues, but in fact, it's true. These numbers are enormous. So, the kinds of numbers we are talking about in the next round of investments, both for mitigation as well as adaptation, are really high and in the trillions, right? So whatever this new mechanism is, it will have to mobilize trillions of dollars. Right? And it'll have to mobilize trillions of dollars with, first of all, to do that, it needs a goal. Because this process just started 2 years ago, it doesn't have a goal. I went to this meeting last week, and there were a few EU bureaucrats, and that is one of these Zoom things. And someone says, we need to have more than just a few random bullet points. Okay, so this is after 5 or 6 technical committee meetings, a political meeting, and so on. These are highly, bureaucratic, technocratic types of debates until you get to a COP when it suddenly becomes real, because then you have to start talking about dollars and who's responsible and who should be the beneficiary and so on. So what do we expect in COP28? Well, first, it needs a quantum, right? You need to get some sense for what this fund is, what the amounts are, right? Jeffrey talked about, who might benefit. There's the flip side of that, which is who pays and how. There's always this tension between private and public funding because rich country governments do not want to be on the hook for making public investments. So these sorts of questions will be center stage in COP28. I don't expect much to move forward because I don't think that much work has been done on this question. Coming back to the EU bureaucrats' statement, but what I expect will happen is some of this will get debated, thrashed out. The politicians will be there making some decisions, and perhaps in COP29, which is supposed to be held somewhere in Eastern Europe, but Russia objected, so I don't know where it's going to be held. It's unclear. We may see some further action on this critical problem of trying to mobilize trillions of dollars so we can actually get down that Paris downward slope. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, that's me. Okay, I'm going to talk about the elephant in the COP room. Actually, as you know, the United Emirates are hosting the COP, so obviously the elephant is the room itself, the big tent at least. Okay, so why is it the elephant? 65% of anthropogenic emissions come from that sector. There's a very heavy presence of the industry lobbyists from that sector at all COP meetings. Global Witness has now taken an approach of systematically documenting who these guys are. Yet it appears very rarely in official COP. And that's surprising because when you look at the antecedent of the COP, the very early scientific discussions about that, and one was held in the late 80s in Montreal, well, there was the idea that it should have been something that deals with the source, and so cutting basically production of fossil fuel. Yet, magically, this big elephant has been quietened through the negotiation process. So why? Well, in large part because COP has followed a demand-driven approach, and as we discussed, there is a veto power. Veto power comes from powerful countries also, and so obviously, they're very realistic about the political economic interest at play, the geostrategic interest at play, etc. So COP has dealt, with fossil fuels through demand management, carbon tax, etc., setting targets, but with the idea that if you did that, if you destroy demand, then you'll destroy production overall. But we all know that, as long as somebody produces a good that is kind of useful, it's kind of pretty efficient. And I have to say, I wrote a book on oil. Oil is certainly quite magical, not only for us all to kind of circulate, and travel and do all these things, but also for the countries that get those massive windfalls, economic windfalls, etc. Okay, so there is some hope, I would say, for demand destruction, and we've seen a great acceleration of notably the electrification of transportation. And so I think we're going to get there, possibly, but of course, it doesn't mean that extraction will stop. It's just we're going to be extracting other things. And I don't want to go into that talk at the moment, but it's very important. But nonetheless, there is a lot of people who think that supply side should be put back on the agenda, and there are good reasons for that. The first thing is demand-driven has many inconveniences, many sources of leakages, etc. And so a complementary approach is very necessary. The other one is that it takes relatively few fossil fuel producers to have a major effect. So if there was international cooperation among the top 5, top 10 producers, would really see important progress. The third thing is it helps you to understand what is the price horizon. It allows for better planning, the rhythm at which those transitions can take place. If we up to the vagaries of whether Putin has decided to invade Ukraine or not on the 27th of February, well, we may see or not a price of oil that goes up and down, and that will influence decision making regarding investments, etc. So if you do any economics, you know that prices is key and determined by supply and demand. We need to play with those variables in a more rational way and a more cooperative way. So for now, the picture is quite bad on the production. On the red line, you see what basically are the government plans and production. So, every government authorize, fossil fuel to be extracted, of course, so they can keep track of these things. And we're up to increasing production until 2035 at the moment. So another decade of increase. Well, we should be on those ones. So the purple one or the green one, depending on the 1.5 or 2.5. So we're not on track. And again, those are the projected ones by, like it's long-term investment. So it's already in the books, but more could come in 2035, etc. We could stay up there on the plateau quite for a long time. Okay, so I just wanted to do a tiny bit of archival history here. So where are we? You remember Kyoto Protocol? Well, I was COP3. 25 years ago. It took one generation to make a tiny move with regard to fossil fuel. Tiny move was what? Well, it got to be mentioned, fossil fuel, but attached with it was subsidies. So it's like saying, don't subsidize fossil fuel too much. Okay, it's not good. And it took 25 years to get there. Okay, plus a few more years, of course, because it starts from 89. Huh? Anyway, so we nonetheless have seen progress with the COP26 at the Glasgow Pact, and that was good. The UK government, as you know, is an oil producer, so it was nice to see that they were trying to do something. And it calls basically upon parties to accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, recognizing the need for support towards a just transition. So good verbs. They were nonetheless like two good things that were out there. So first there was I could call it a club of first movers, people who said, we need to take upon ourselves to stop producing fossil fuel. And my own country, France, took the step and said by 2040, there's be no production whatsoever on French territory, and they banned fracking, etc. But nonetheless, led by Denmark, we used to produce a lot of gas and has shifted now to wind, as you know. And Costa Rica, they led an initiative, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. And so they are committed to not produce, not have new licenses, etc. So they're really taking that hard line, but they're all very minor producers. The other one is basically a relatively soft initiative, is to end direct public support for international unabated fossil fuel energy sector. So all across. So that's pretty good, and they've committed to push that. It's 36 states, and didn't go very far at Sharm el-Sheikh on the subsequent one, and probably will not on this one. Okay, so for the BOGA members, what do they commit to? They say we will commit to end new concession, licensing rounds for oil and gas production and exploration, and set a Paris-aligned date for ending oil and gas production and exploitation. So these are the countries. It's a very soft approach in a way, because it's just saying, hey, join a club. They've got 3 categories. The members, that's for the members. They've got the kind of associates, and they have the friends who are waving and saying, maybe one day we'll become a member. Anyway, it's growing slowly. Importantly, it's based with IISD a little bit, is helping. So it's great to see that this is also an initiative by a Canadian NGO, but not by the Canadian government. Okay, so what to expect, to conclude, to expect from COP28 and beyond? As you can guess, slow progress. First, the geopolitical context is not good. Everybody is screaming for like supply diversification. It means you're not going to be stopping production if you can. The COP agenda is very much focused on adaptation, renewables. Of course, IRENA is in Dubai, loss and damage, and the host country is kind of perceived as pro-fuel. There will be a pursuit of club approach. One of my former colleagues and Minister of Energy and Mines in Colombia has moved BOGA into the associate category, so we could see things there, and there are other initiatives. But most importantly, we see a lot of civil society mobilizing around this idea of a multilateral agreement on supply side management. So what I invite all of you to do is to check that thing called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the idea that we can end new exploration and production project, we can move towards a managed decline in production, and we can promote a just transition. But that will also, of course, take important principles to be agreed upon. It will need transparency so that everybody feels like they can play the game, an institution to host this, enforcement mechanism, and financial support. So I end that there, and thank you so much again for listening.
So thanks very much to all the panelists for setting up the topics. At this time, we'll start with some questions that I'll give to the panel, and just to warm things up. But I invite all of you in the room and online to go to slido.com, enter the code 4041835, and put in your questions, upload questions of others, and we'll turn to those shortly. So 4041835. So to get things going, and maybe I'm going to actually start and put Philippe on the spot, unless you're leaving the room. No, they're on the okay. And maybe ask everybody from the perspective of the topic that they spoke to, where does Canada sit within the context of the negotiations? And that's why speaking, let's say we'll start with fossil fuels, and where do you think Canada is going to lie, and what are the challenges for Canada? So,
okay, I'm not privy, and I think Cathy, you may have more insights on Canada. We have an academic champion on this, Angela Carter, who has done some excellent work. So I would say check with Angela Carter's work, etc. Maybe Jeffrey, you want to jump in also. My sense is the position for Canada has been quite clear. First, it's a provincial responsibility to decide on production, and it's been very difficult. And you can imagine the provincial government at the moment is not very oriented towards this type of things. So I'm not very, very optimistic. However, with an undergraduate here, we build a global database of all fossil fuel constraints, the very first in the world. It has now been automatized with AI, and they beat us because they can work day and night for free, pretty much. But we gathered about 2,000 initiatives taken around 106 countries, And I have to say, I'm pretty proud because Canada had the most diverse types of initiatives to supply constraints. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things on the Canadian front. However, the government at the federal and provincial level has been very clear. We continue with production. We try to ship it and export it and make money from it. And that money is supposed to help us with making a transition. So that's a kind of another Faustian bargain. Thank you.
So there are countries that import oil, there are countries that export oil, and the incentives are very different. So I think Canada and many other all fossil fuel exporting countries tend to be, they only have to, under the Paris Agreement, focus on their territorial emissions. These are the emissions that are released within Canada. Those are our responsibility. And I think Canada and many other fossil fuel exports have thrown their hands in the air, said, and you know, the stuff that we export and gets burned somewhere else is someone else's responsibility. And you know, that's quite consistent. One of the problems, though, is that all of those countries that are exporting think they're going to be the ones to sell the last drop. And so, you know, that's why we've got this, the production gap based on fossil fuel that's being produced is bigger than the emissions gap based on the demand side policies. There's an overproduction happening because they're all trying to get as much of their product to market, and Canada's, you know, no different. It's bad all round. I would say we're no better than the rest of them.
Lynn, anything on finance?
I just want to, well, not on the finance, but I want to talk about BC and natural gas.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just Alberta. Let's not beat up on Alberta alone, although they deserve most of it. BC is also, you know, we're building pipelines, you're exporting natural gas, and you'll hear lots of talk about natural gas as a bridge fuel. Well, you know, once you go beyond a few % leakage, and depending on which impacts you're worried about, especially if there are impacts in the short term, then natural gas really doesn't give you any bridge. It's a bridge to nowhere, right? And so I think I just wanted to add that, to bring BC into the mix here as well.
Sure. Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit on domestic and also on kind of international level where Canada sits in the negotiations. I think the global stocktake is supposed to be this review, like, you know, it provides its assessment on international level, but it has relevance for Canada as well. I think over the last couple of years, in BC at least, we've seen so many losses and damages related to climate change impacts, and we've seen so many climate impacts firsthand, from the fire to the flooding in Nova Scotia. So there is really a need for increasing resilience here in Canada. And this year, we've got a new thing called the National Adaptation Strategy. It's a federal level plan of how Canada is going to increase our resilience and protect our communities from climate change impacts. So now there's a problem, you know, it's within provincial responsibility. So why is the federal government taking initiative on this? Because adaptation doesn't stop at the border between BC and Alberta. There requires a coordinated approach between different provinces to kind of confront this challenge. And the federal government acts in a role to kind of provide that coordination mechanism and to provide the necessary funding for local communities to implement some of those adaptation projects. So right now, the urgency from the global stocktake is telling us that we need to transition our plan from plan to implementation. And we really need to make sure that we get this right in the next decade. Otherwise, it will be way too late and we're going to exceed the limits to adaptation. And then I'm going to bring it up to the international level a little bit and say one good thing and one bad thing about Canada, because we love balance. So the bad thing about Canada is it consistently tried to undermine the principles of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is equity. So this is kind of goes back to historical responsibility. Canada does not recognize, well, it does recognize, but it doesn't want to admit legally in writing that we had a historical responsibility to cause climate change, and we don't have an obligation to kind of provide the finance, to provide the technology, to provide all these supports to developing countries. So, and their main argument is China, India, Brazil, all these emerging economies, they are different now compared to 30 years ago. They have the capacity to do more in terms of emission reduction, in terms of funding their own climate action, but that's just simply not true and also not fair, because we caused, or the rich nations caused climate change in the first place. And now we are kind of passing the buck to developing countries and hoping that they would kind of pick up the slack. That's just not right. But the good thing about Canada is we are a champion of gender equality and human rights in negotiations. And that's the one thing that can keep going around in negotiation room. Canada is very strong on pushing for those principles because there have been allegations about land grabs and rights violations when implementing climate change projects, especially in developing countries. So maintaining those safeguards and ensuring those principles are in international law is super important for the Canadian government. And that's the good thing about Canada's stance in the negotiations.
So we'll do one very quick round, ask for just really quick answers. What will success look like and what will failure look like for each of you from COP? And maybe we'll start with Kathy.
I'm actually pretty damn discouraged. And I get this question and I always try suck it up and come up with something really good. But every once in a while, I think we should acknowledge this is really bad. So for me, success would look like citizens, especially in democracies who have an opportunity to vote, backing up their governments to do the things that are hard, because things are going to have to change. And the reason they keep taking wimpy positions in international negotiations is that they're afraid that we're going to throw them out of office. And so to a large degree, it's up to us. And success would look like people being willing to pay $2 more cents a liter per year for gasoline.
Yeah, I hope I have a more optimistic answer, but I don't. I think success for me for this COP is to make sure that we have strong negotiated outcomes. There are so many different initiatives that's been going on, but that is not negotiated. So countries are not actually putting in hours to negotiate the text. So a lot of the initiatives are non-binding, and a lot of the high-level events that the UAE presidency is trying to promote is not necessarily useful in kind of a legal sense. So we really need to make sure the negotiations are going well. Countries are able to agree on, the fundamental things like phasing out fossil fuel, or we need more money to, do climate action. So for me, a really strong negotiated outcome that's not being distracted by everything that's being put on by Dubai, by UAE government around the sidelines. That's super important.
I don't know, I've been thinking hard about this question, and the one hope is that renewables have really dropped in costs, right? You can, in many parts of the world now, shut down a coal plant that is operational and build a solar plant or a wind farm, and the electricity would still be cheaper. So this is an operational plant. You're, sort of putting the capital to rest there. So, that's a really important breakthrough that's happened in the past 5 to 6 years. And so one hopes, I don't have much hope from Canada on any of this. I mean, Canada's response has been, other than the carbon tax, pretty lame. But, I'm hoping countries that can actually show some leadership, and China and India, for example, right? This constant finger pointing at China and India, well, maybe they should stand up and say, okay, we're doing this. I mean, China is doing it. In fact, China is responsible for the dramatic drop in costs of renewable energy. We don't talk about this enough. Batteries, solar, wind, it's all learning by doing in China, okay? And China still burns a bunch of coal, yes. So maybe China should be, sort of moving away from that. So that's one hope. And the second hope is India. I'm not saying that, hope in India at this point, but anyway, let's hope India actually manages to do the same thing. The reason I'm a bit cynical is that there's some sort of political capture by coal companies in India right now. But again, even there is a real change in sort of the price of renewables and what it means for generating electricity in a country that is really hungry for it. So long answer is that's the kind of thing I hope, is the price of renewables drives us into a new domain.
Yep. Well, I would echo you, but in order not to repeat you, I would say I really hope that the financial sector really gets the message that fossil fuels are kind of toxic, stranded assets are on the horizon, and basically they back renewables, but in a way also that is very respectful of local communities, etc. So that we don't reproduce the kind of stuff we've had with fossil fuel, etc. At a very pragmatic level, I hope that a few more members in BOGA will join, that the idea of a treaty matures, and that there's a bit of a refinement, that we see some champions emerging among a number of countries that would say, yes, we'll back the treaty. So not only the Vanuatus, etc. of this world, but a few major countries that have diplomatic force and would represent a little bit like an effort. A country like Norway or Canada would be wonderful, even if it's just to talk about this in a more open and public way. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
And I'll just add my hint of optimism. I think it's important to look at COP also in the context of what else is happening in the world. And we've got some really challenging situations, but that actually could be an optimistic view. So for example, Ukraine really exposed Europe's dependence on fossil fuels, and provides an opportunity for Europe actually to become independent through the use of renewables. As one example, we're seeing the conflict in the Middle East, and it hasn't really shaken out in terms of fossil fuels, but if you can remember way back when I was 10 years old, we had an oil embargo in the 70s related to a conflict, and so that may be coming as well. And so I would say, actually, I would lower expectations from this COP, but if anything positive comes from it, given the context of what's happening in the world, I would say that's an optimistic view. And we may have to accept, even though we don't have lots of time, there's inertia outside of COP, we may have to accept that this is a year when actually nothing really happens just because of the context. And then, next year, maybe things optimistically will be better. But again, that's a pretty optimistic view. So let's turn to audience questions. And again, keep those coming in and keep voting them. I'm going to take care of sort of an easy one first, which is how are COP locations chosen? And I'll add, why the hell is it in the UAE? But really, maybe add a little bit more to that. Is there any good that can come from holding it in the UAE, and maybe perhaps shifting the focus to an emphasis on fossil fuels? And maybe, Philippe, I'll let you get started on that, perhaps.
I had the chance of working on an initiative called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And one day, Qatar said, hey, we'll pay for it. And we thought, wow, great, they're going to basically be completely transparent about their fossil fuel income, and maybe the whole Middle East will follow. No, it was very nicely hosted, but nothing happened. So with the UAE, what I'm a little bit optimistic is, it decided to finance and host IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. And so it's possible that on the renewable front, it's actually going to put some money there. There's a lot of money slushing around the region. So it's possible that we'll see something there. Yeah.
I actually don't know how they're chosen. Yuan, there's this weird thing that as global demand for oil declines, the winners that, in terms of what share of that production they account for are those that have light sweet crude, like Middle Eastern countries. So there's actually a weird logic that if those countries think that climate action is going to happen, they could be the relative winners compared. You know who the relative loser is? Canada, because our oil is really crappy and very costly to produce. So there might be some weird logic there where, in the best possible scenario, the UAE would want to show some leadership because in a world of decline, they could be a relative winner. Yeah. I was so discouraging initially. That's the best I could come up with.
Yeah, there was a recent piece in The Economist that actually looked at UAE's leadership, and apparently I don't know, this is Economist, so it might be gossip, but it's 25 billion. They want to make a investment of $25 billion into the loss and damage fund, or they want to kick it off or something, right? So it's entirely possible, because when a few $1 billion is no object, you can do these kinds of things to do some greenwashing. Yeah, a few billion here or there doesn't matter. But a non-cynical part of me says they have a lot of money. They could use it to invest in renewables all over the world. And those numbers we are talking about in the trillions, those few hundred billions could actually go some way if they're willing to make that investment. So maybe they have a role to play.
I think I can answer on how they're chosen. Essentially, there are different regional groups within the UNCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this year, it's I think it's the Arab World Turn. I forgot the actual name for that region, but essentially the regional members vote on which member from that region will take the presidency. And then whoever is the presidency gets to host the COP. So that's the quick and dirty answer. And that's also why Russia is vetoing every single EU member in the Eastern Europe regional group.
Yeah, and Jeffrey just alluded to there's already sort of controversy about where the next COP is going to be. And it's the turn of Eastern Europe, and you just heard sort of what's going on there. So again, very interesting. And again, the global context, sort of what's happening now, really important for COP. So next question, in reference to Canada's consumption and export emissions, how should responsibility be taken? And do you think that it is something worth applying to all countries?
Yeah, I wrote a paper on this if you're interested, so you check my name. But in short, follow the money a little bit. So responsibility should not only be about who consumes it, because there are many countries who have little choice. They're not going to afford Teslas tomorrow morning. So you've got to see who is making the money. I think there is a direct responsibility from that as well. So that's where I would put it in major ways. Otherwise, ideally there are different ways of looking at it. You would first go for the production of oil that has the lowest emissions. So then you would look at cost of production to increase the rents, etc. And that's why Canada would be bottom of the barrel pretty much. But importantly, I think it's also about the developmental potential of oil rents. And so ideally, you would see the richest oil producers that have already the most reserves, the financial reserves, cut their productions first. Okay, so we'd see Norway in particular, which has amassed $1.5 trillion in savings compared to Alberta, a lot. And and on the contrary, emerging fossil fuel producers that are developing countries would still be afforded the opportunity of generating rents in the future for their development. Okay.
Actually, I am going to jump on this one. There are 3 different, carbon gets taken out of the ground, it gets burned to produce stuff, and those goods get sent somewhere. And you could account for the same emissions at different points. You could count for your responsibility is because you're taking it out of the ground and you have to reduce. That would be a production-based accounting. There's the point where they're burned. That's what's in the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. Countries are responsible for the emissions that come from the fossil fuels they burn, regardless of where those fossil fuels came from. And there's a third way that is sometimes discussed, which is based on the carbon footprint of consumption. So there are a lot of countries, especially in Western Europe, that have relatively low consumption of fossil fuels, but that's because they import all these goods that were produced somewhere else, often produced by burning coal as a source of electricity. And so there are different accounting mechanisms. Canada exports another Canada's worth of carbon in the form of unburned fossil fuels. So we'd look a lot worse if we took responsibility for actually getting the stuff out of the ground. Ironically, we look pretty good compared to, say, Western European countries in terms of our carbon footprint of consumption is kind of comparable to our territorial emissions. And that's because we both produce a lot of emissions to send fossil fuels elsewhere, and we export the goods from China and other countries.
And I'll just add that these different accounting mechanisms can lead to some really bizarre behaviors. So one example that's relevant to BC is we do some really crazy things, like we ship wood pellets on diesel-powered boats to Scandinavia to burn as green energy. And that's purely a result of these kind of accounting systems. So that's where some of these, these details really matter. And governments, and I would also single out our government, are really good at manipulating these to their own benefit. So this is why, the kinds of things that Jeffrey's involved in, the details really, really matter. And we've seen sort of mistake after mistake at previous COPs with sort of these loopholes that and governments are sort of in some ways doing what they're supposed to do. They're maximizing their own interests, and you can't really blame them. But and again, that's one of the challenges of COP. So let's go. Maybe let's just another process question. What tips do you have? And I'll single out Kathy, maybe. Do you have for UBC COP28 delegates to make progress in their areas of expertise or interest? So for people going to COP.
Focus. There is so much stuff going on all the time. Pick your topic, go through the agenda, and then select, what you're going to do every day, because you can't follow it all. Absolutely no way. And learn how to use the UN website. You may want to start early on that one. And take healthy food with you. The food is awful at COP. Anyone else?
I'm trying to channel my youth delegate energies. Take care of yourself. It's very intense. It's also emotional. You might cry. Take a napkin with you, but also it's really good to check in with yourself once in a while and remind yourself that there has been a lot of progress being made in very slow. Because when you step into negotiation room, you'll be like, why on earth are they still talking about a comma? But commas do matter in international negotiations, and that's kind of the reality check you get for going to these conferences. But so really take a moment to care about your mental health, to check in with yourself, and to take care of yourself during this crazy period of a trade show. And it's going to be 70,000 people in an expo area. So it's a lot of people. Just yeah. Also have fun. There's a lot of different events going on. So go to events that match with your interest, and that's usually a great place to network as well.
Just an observation, maybe where you have the COP matters. I went to a COP in Delhi a couple of decades ago, and the food was fantastic.
I'm like, Spain. Well, Scotland's not known for its food.
Well, I know the COP in Scotland, there was the one in Scotland, there was a massive shortage of accommodation. So people said it was wonderful because they ended up staying in people's homes. And I had one friend who said she slept under the table with the Indonesian delegation, under somebody's coffee table. So she said it was actually fantastic in terms of bringing people together. I doubt that's going to be the case in the UAE. I think there's plenty of hotel space there. So next question, I'm not quite sure I'm getting it, but I'll read it. So much of the focus is funding adaptation and mitigation initiatives of low and middle income nations, but what about addressing climate vulnerability within these nations? Yeah. Got it. Thank you for clarifying. So I'll just add for the online audience. So the question is really about, we have economic disparities within countries, and so high emitting sort of individuals or groups of individuals within countries. And is that perhaps an opportunity to kind of reframe the high income versus low income country setting? And maybe Milind, do you want to give it a shot?
I don't know, you tax their consumption, right? It just seems to me that, so for example, India, which always shows up as a really sort of low per capita emissions because it has 1.42 billion people. But in fact, there is at least a Germany inside India because there is 50, 80, I don't know how many million people who are driving around, flying around, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's convenient for the Indian government to essentially say, look, our per capita emissions are low. I think the way you would do it is to tax the hell out of all these, the so-called luxury emissions or whatever, just tax carbon.
We just finished a paper on this, on the decarbonized class, and I mean, it was an interesting paper. I would draw your attention to the Oxfam reports on this. Maybe that's where the Guardian got their origin stuff. So it's not only about consumption, but also, who is making money out of this, and essentially the carbonized economy is still very, very profitable. So there's also like question about taxation of dividends and all these things. So yeah, there needs to be a fiscal framework. That goes beyond the kind of voluntary donations by the hyper carbonized class that feels better if they make a few donations for this or that. Okay, so thanks.
So it seems like we're getting a mix of sort of topic questions and also logistics about just COP. So I'm gonna turn to another sort of COP organizational question, and I'll actually combine two. So can you explain the roles and powers of the COP presidency? So does the fact that COP is being hosted by Dubai increase the space taken up by fossil fuel companies? And maybe just to add to that, does having an annual meeting provide the opportunity to, let's say, kick the can to the next meeting versus sort of getting down to an agreement? Maybe Jeffrey, you can pick a stab at those.
Sure. I think on first question, yeah, COP presidency has a lot of power. They set the agenda, they set the tone of the meeting. So they can, as Michael has mentioned, kind of there's so many different thematic days, and there are so many different things that are outside of negotiations that are, having an influence on global climate conversations. They might not have, as I said, they might not have a direct influence on the negotiations, but they still matter in kind of the grand scheme of climate action. So this year's COP president is very focused on youth engagement for some reason. I don't know why, but they are very focused on that. So they have a youth day, they have a health day, so they have a lot of different agendas they want to push forward. So some of these agendas are fantastic, some of them might not be. So in that arena, the COP president have a lot of power. They are also the people who are going to be writing up the final text. So if countries don't agree on a lot of things, and that being forwarded to kind of the last day of COP, as Professor Harrison has mentioned, it will be up to the COP president to kind of propose compromises, to propose draft language that countries will then try to come to a consensus with. So in that matter, in that regard, if we think back to 2015, with France being the COP president, they've done a fantastic job in facilitating the negotiation to reach that consensus between different countries and to balance different interest groups. Versus you see last year in Egypt, where the Egyptian presidency didn't do such a good job in reaching that compromise, in kind of making sure that everyone's happy. Everyone kind of left very unhappy at the end of COP27. So it's this year's COP presidency's job to kind of make sure everyone's happy, and then we still can get like a ambitious outcome from it. So something in that regard. I forgot what the second question is.
There's the presidency, the country that is the host, and there's the actual president. There's an individual who stands at the front and holds a gavel. And at the very end, when they're trying to make deals, that person is going around and talking with the individuals who represent blocks of countries or individual countries. And so there's also an element that this is personal. It's personal for them, like the success or failure of this COP, the ability to reach a decision text that has anything useful in it. There's a certain element of like the pride of their country not failing at this COP. And there was a key moment at COP, I'm mixing up my numbers, 27 in Glasgow, where the president, what was his name? Pardon? 26, right? Sorry, I missed a whole one. The president, whose name I'm forgetting, who's a UK cabinet minister, thought he had a deal. And then at the last minute, India, China, Brazil kind of pulled back on some of the fossil fuel language. This guy choked up in like a room full of hundreds of people standing at the front. He started to cry because he had to accept this weakening of a deal. So I guess the thing I would add is there's a lot of people who really care in these meetings too. And it is really hard to get this kind of agreement. But I've also been struck by how damn hard they try. Like they're working all night. When this thing ends late, it's not because they went back to their cushy hotel rooms. They negotiate through the whole damn night. And I remember talking to the US lead about the Kyoto Protocol, and he said at the very end, they went behind some like, stand to strike the deal on the Kyoto Protocol, and there was Japan, the US, the EU. I think that was it. And they have to go in alphabetical order, so they have to make a deal and make a handshake that they're not going to stab each other in the back when they announce their target. And he said, and my people have been negotiating for days without sleep, and they're laying around on the floor passed out. Like, so people really are, it's personal. And there's a lot of folks really invested, which is not really answering the question.
About sort of kicking the can, like the annual.
Oh, I think that was like I don't think they want to fail. They want to actually produce something. It's embarrassing for the whole country to be the COP president and like do nothing. It would be better to not host it than to look like you really screwed it up. That's my take.
I want to add the negotiator perspective. So opposite of what the president might want, negotiators might want to kick the can down to the next COP. Like this year, we're going to debate where we have an agenda item called a global goal on adaptation, which is essentially trying to set a global goal on what an adequate adaptation level is. So we're talking about indicators, we're talking about targets, we're talking about all these metrics. That these negotiators, they're poli-sci kids like me. We have no idea what we're talking about half the times. So what they want to So what they want to do is we're going to come up with the targets, and we're going to kick the can down the road to come up with specific indicators for each one of those targets, because 2 weeks is just way too short for anyone to come up with a global agreement on something so complex and so comprehensive. So for the negotiators, they might want to say that we don't want a bad deal, and if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, and we might as well kind of have one more year to do this. So sometimes it's not a bad thing, but a lot of times it is a terrible thing that you just keep trying to kick the can down the road.
Yeah, but it's also on any particular topic, how much prep has gone into it, right? And so I think there's a point at which then the bureaucrats and the analysts have come up with the best thing they can, and then the politicians have to sort of trust that and endorse it, I think. And that happens. I guess that's where some of this leadership stuff comes in, as in Paris and so on. So.
Just to add on that, there is a pre-COP, as you know, also for some of you, and that's also where it happens. The G7 has a Sherpa, as you may know. So whoever hosts the G7 has a Sherpa that goes around all the G7 countries and makes sure that, so it's a year-long activity, actually, from one G7 to the next. And, one could imagine similar arrangements being made.
Yeah, and I'll just add from the sort of science perspective and the progress report perspective, I think it is really important to do this annually, but also not to expect that each COP is monumental. So it's this progress and inertia, and challenging things take time. There's this expectation, I think the media often plays into this, that it's a make or break every time, and to some extent that's true, but I would look for incremental progress each COP, and if you start to space them out, you start to lose that inertia, but that's just my perspective. So we're getting close to the end of the session. I'm just going to, and apologies for those of you who submitted questions online. I didn't get through all of them, but hopefully we addressed some key questions that you have. But I want to ask the panelists sort of one more question to hopefully leave on a little bit of an optimistic note. And it's, what are you hopeful about? So I'm not going to give you the opportunity to say what you're not hopeful about, but pick one thing that you're hopeful about. And we'll start at Philippe and we can move down.
I would be hopeful for a relative rapid decline in fossil fuel demand and supply.
I'm hopeful that we can do something about methane emissions from natural gas and pipelines.
I guess I'm really hopeful for all the people who actually work in climate negotiation. They actually do care about this, whether they're from Saudi Arabia, China, or countries that you don't even imagine climate change is a priority for them. But these negotiators, they really do care, and they're really trying to do their job good in these conferences. So I'm hopeful for that.
I'm hopeful for some of these clubs or kind of mini-lateral agreements like BOGA, powering past coal, the ending of foreign funding for fossil fuels, where short of getting all 197 signatories or whatever it is on board, if you get the right group in one of those, they can start doing things and put pressure on others, and that may create more momentum.
And I'm going to second what Malin said. I'm actually quite hopeful about methane, and it's low-hanging fruit. There's lots of action. The global methane pledge has a lot of inertia, and hope just to see continued success with that. And methane's really important because it buys time for some of the more challenging aspects of CO2 emissions reduction. So with that, thank you again for joining us today. Thanks to all of the panelists. Thanks to Leslie for all of your organization and putting this together. And thanks to all of you attending here in person and those of you online. A shout out to the watch party at UBC Okanagan. Hope you're all there and that it was useful for you as well. We are planning more events to get people together at UBC to engage in discussions around climate solutions. We invite you to visit our website, and you will see on the screen upcoming events that we have scheduled already for December and January. So thanks again very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you for watching today's session. You can see our upcoming events and register for our newsletter at climatesolutions.ubc.ca.